In the Master of Science side, which is where I primarily supervise graduate students in the MSc, we offer majors research-based graduate programs in agriculture, in archaeology, biochemistry, biological sciences, chemistry, a number of different computer science options with different specializations, environmental science, geography, kinesiology, which is my discipline, mathematics, neuroscience, physics, psychology, and also remote sensing. The other thing we offer is an individualized multidisciplinary MSc. So there is a possibility to create a bit of a specialized Master of Science program that's individualized to you and perhaps crosses some different disciplines. So we have a lot of options and a lot of flexibility in our Master of Science programming.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, in the humanities, we also offer a substantial variety of MA programs as well, including the following: an MA in art, Canadian studies, cultural, social, and political thought. Now, that program has contributions from different disciplines and different professors. I'll maybe leave it to Suzanne to say more about that program because she knows far more about it than I do. But following on from that, we also offer an MA in dramatic arts, in English, in French, as well as in a combined French and Spanish program, an MA in women and gender studies, history, Indigenous studies, and just as there's an individual multidisciplinary MSc program, there's also the equivalent in the MA program. You can also take an MA in an individual multidisciplinary program. And last but not least, we have possible MAs in philosophy and religious studies.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and I'm happy to be here. So I'll just talk a little bit about the CSPT major. So it's the Cultural, Social, and Political Thought. And as Chris said, we offer a Master of Arts degree in that, but we also offer a PhD in CSPT. And the PhD in the CSPT is the only way at the University of Lethbridge to get a PhD within the realm of social sciences and humanities. It is an interdisciplinary program with coursework being taught by professors from women and gender studies, sociology, Indigenous studies, kinesiology, history, sometimes English. I guess we can go into some of the details a bit later with other questions, but it is an interdisciplinary program. So your coursework and your cohort, you will be with folks from a wide range of disciplines.
First of all, there are scholarships available that you can apply for. And there's different ways that graduate students can obtain funding for their studies. So we have an internal scholarship called the ALGRA, University of Lethbridge Graduate Student Award, Graduate Research Award, sorry, that's what it's called. And it is varying amounts depending on so that's a competitive process, and everyone is considered for that scholarship upon application. We also have graduate teaching assistantship awards. So many graduate students have the opportunity to help teach undergraduate students. So acting as a teaching assistant for professors for different undergraduate courses. And that's employment, but it is specific, employment for graduate students. So that's often a financial benefit to students, and international students are definitely eligible for that as well. And then finally, when you find a supervisor, depending on the research project that you're going to be working on with them and depending on their funding situation, often supervisors can also provide, a research assistantship award to graduate students. And then beyond that, there's also a number of different scholarships. And so perhaps, Ashley, we could post a link to our scholarships and awards page at some point in the chat. And there's a long list of different scholarships and awards that you can apply for. So the answer is there are scholarships, certainly for international students and domestic students. And some of them you have to apply specifically for, and some of them you're automatically considered for when you apply to a program. No GRE or GMAT for any of our programs at the U of L.
You really need to find a supervisor who whose work aligns with your interests, and that they express willingness to work with you, and therefore can also write a supervisory letter of support, which is part of the requirement for your application. So yes, you do need to find a supervisor to work with you.
Yeah, just to further Suzanne's comments, having sat on the adjudication committee for applications to an MA program, it definitely weakens your application substantially if you do not have a supervisor lined up before we look at your application.
And I would recommend that you do that well in advance of the application deadline, to contact a supervisor a week before your application is due. Is not reasonable, because there's going to be discussion between yourself and the supervisor. Your potential supervisor has to write a letter, which takes a lot of time. So this is one of the first things that you want to do well in advance of submitting your application.
So we do have, so first of all, none of the graduate certificate programs require a supervisor. There's a few graduate programs that don't require a supervisor. Some of the graduate certificates, there's another list somewhere, like the Master of Nursing. We also have an MA in economics, and the economics department does take a slightly different approach in that
That's true.
they admit a small number of students without a supervisor, and then they find a supervisor in their first year of study. So there are some that don't require that, and you can figure that out online. But I'm going to actually add a bit more strength to what Suzanne and Chris said. The programs that do require a supervisor, which is most of them, because they're research-based, right? So you're going to be actually doing research with a faculty member. And it's not that it will weaken your application, it's that you will not be approved. You will not be admitted with it. Because I do some of the final, as an associate dean, I do some of the final approvals. And we absolutely do not admit students into a research-based program without a supervisor. So it's not helpful, it's mandatory, really. We have a number of pathways to meet the English language requirement. I think if you've studied in English at your undergrad, you would have no problem meeting that requirement. So you can submit unofficial for the initial stages of the application. And there are document deadlines that are listed on the website. So eventually an official will be required before before you finally begin a program. But certainly submit your application with unofficial, and because we understand that sometimes it can take some time to get the official transcripts. So absolutely your application will be reviewed for unofficial, but before there's a final offer of admission, the official documents would need to be received. I'll speak to the admission requirements for the MSc, which is a bachelor's degree, so an undergraduate degree in a related discipline from a degree, a recognized degree granting institution. And it's a minimum GPA of 3.0, that's on a 4.0 scale, of the last 20 graded courses. And also, if you already have a graduate degree, then it would actually be based on the most recently completed. So it's your highest level of education completed is what the GPA, admission GPA, is calculated on. As well as we said, demonstrated English language proficiency for international graduate students, and securing a potential supervisor, as we've already mentioned.
I'll be very brief because the MA requirements are basically identical to those for the MSc, except of course, if you're taking an MA, you're coming out of a humanities program and so forth, rather than a science one. But the The GPA requirement 3.0 in your last 20 courses is the same, and so forth.
I think for the PhD, it's different. So again, entry requirements or admission requirements for the PhD program at U of L programs follow, what has been said in terms of, but this time, you have to have a completed master's degree from a recognized degree granting university. But again, it's evidence of scholarly competence, the English language proficiency. PhD programs at the U of L, the GPA is 3.0, except for the CSPT PhD program, the GPA is 3.5. And again, just to reiterate the question about securing a supervisor, you absolutely must secure a supervisor to apply for all graduate degrees, but particularly for a PhD program. You just can't apply to the PhD program without having engaged in conversation and secured a supervisor. And then the other things that, that come with that are your transcripts, letters of reference, your CV, your own letter of intent, that kind of thing. So yeah, that would be for the PhD.
So maybe I could just take a brief minute to speak a little bit about, the related discipline piece, and Chris and Suzanne can chime in as needed. So just to be really clear, as I'm sure you all know, a graduate degree is a very specialized degree, right? You're really specializing in a particular topic. And so to a master's degree is not the place that you can completely switch disciplines, right? You need to have some relevant background in order to deeply study a particular area. So for example, a graduate degree is not the place to switch, from the sciences to the humanities, or these kinds of big changes. But at the same time, within a particular sort of field, within the sciences, within the social sciences, or within the humanities, I think there is room to take skills that you learned in your undergrad and apply them to a different field of research. And so Chris said he had a very specific example, and I can actually give a very specific example of myself. So my undergraduate degree was in science and biology, but I became very interested in exercise science. And so I moved into a kinesiology program for graduate studies. So different discipline, but at the same time, I had the science background to be able to do research in kinesiology from a science perspective. And so there's room sort of within broad disciplines, I think, to move around in the areas that you want to study, but you have to have enough background to be able to do the work. And this is also a big part of that, finding a supervisor, right? So communicating with a supervisor who understands the background that you have, you've made a plan for a research project or a program that will complement your skills, but allow you to delve into the area that you're interested in. And so I don't know if Suzanne or Chris have anything to add or correct. I think that's right.
That's good.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, as a historian, in terms of quote unquote related disciplines, theoretically, our departmental committee, our graduate education committee, would consider applications from fields, say like sociology, political science, or what have you, because those are disciplines whose subject matter overlaps to a considerable degree with history. Of course, they're coming at it from a slightly different perspective, perhaps, but in a political science degree, for example, you're learning many of the same skills that you use in history, essay writing, critical thinking skills, and so forth. So, theoretically, if we had someone who had done their undergrad in political science and they wanted subsequently to pursue an MA in history, I don't think the fact that their BA was in political science rather than history in and of itself would disqualify them. Now, the ultimate decision, of course, would be, first of all, up to the prospective supervisor, whether they wanted to supervise this individual, whether they're research interests aligned or what have you, as well as a departmental committee. And in terms of a specific example, we currently have a student in the history department, a grad student who shall remain nameless. Her earlier degrees were actually in classics or classical studies, which is a discipline related specifically to ancient Greek and Roman history. But she is currently doing a graduate degree in our department involving Canadian history. Has nothing at all to do with ancient Greek or Roman history. But nonetheless, she developed the necessary skills, writing, critical thinking, and so forth during her earlier undergrad and graduate degrees that she was able to transition into a graduate degree in Canadian history. So that's, again, another specific example for what it's worth of how you can go from one related discipline to another, subject to the approval of your prospective supervisor and the relevant departmental committee, of course.
It's going to be evaluated very carefully. I would really encourage people who are applying for an MA or a PhD, as we've said, like maybe this is the fourth time, make sure you have a supervisor. Take the time to engage in if the faculty member has agreed to supervise you, that you engage in conversation with this person. Your letter of intent needs to be particularly strong, especially for a PhD program. For the CSPT, you want to make sure that your letters of reference, that when you approach your referees, that you ask them not simply to write you a letter of reference, but to write you a strong letter of reference. Make sure you give your referees enough time to write their reference letters. You can't expect a faculty member to write a reference letter for you within a week of the application being due.
Not necessarily. It helps. And it's one of the things, the committee, when we're going through all of the applications to see which ones to accept, it's one of the things we consider, but it's only one of the possible factors. So if you have an excellent GPA, excellent letters of reference, strong letter of support from your prospective supervisor, and so forth, you should still have an excellent chance of being accepted to your program, regardless of what work experience you have in your field. So yeah, it helps, but it's not a deal breaker, so to speak.
And I would agree. Can I just add to that to say that I think it's, important to think laterally here. I don't think we would necessarily expect MA students coming in to have any, research assistant experience necessarily, but you could include things like if you've done an independent study, that would be research experience. If you've done an applied study, but also let's say you have another part-time job, like just, I don't know, working at the mall or something like that, or with a social service agency, or you've done volunteer work. You can talk about the skills that you've learned from that, time management, organizing, whatever it is, how that applies to your ability to succeed in graduate school, and the qualities that that make you a good candidate, a good MA student. I think that's possible because sometimes, once we take coursework, when we maybe want to change, shift our focus or our program. So I wouldn't say that it's not possible, but it does require, it is bureaucratic to do so. You may have, it may require you finding a new supervisor who may or may not be available, finding a new supervisory committee who may or may not be available. So while it's not impossible, I would say, and Ashley, maybe you have more knowledge about this than me, it will be challenging. It will be challenging to do that.
Would have to go through the relevant departmental
Yeah.
graduate program committee, as well
Yeah.
as the School of Graduate Studies. So yeah, it would have to be
It's a lot of work.
bureaucratically approved on multiple
Multiple
levels.
levels. Yeah.
Yeah.
With no necessary guarantee.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say my biggest tip is to, make sure you're well prepared. Have a supervisor, have a strong letter of intent with a really clear focus of what it is you want to do. Make sure that you can secure the strongest letters of reference possible.
And be sure your reference letters are academic reference letters
Yeah.
for the most part as
Yes.
well. That's a really important thing that we sometimes see
Yes.
really strong reference letters from like an employer or whatever. But remember, the goal here is actually all for your benefit, which is to make sure that we're admitting you to a program you can succeed in, because we want you to be successful. And so they need to be an academic reference that can speak to your ability to do the academic work that you would do in a graduate program.
Yeah.
And in terms of your thesis proposal, the more specific, the better. And again, this is something you can line up with your supervisor, assuming that ideally you've talked to them well in advance of your application. But sometimes, and I'm speaking from my experience on one of these adjudication committees, sometimes we get very vague thesis proposals, which are contained in the prospective student's letter of intent, which is another document within the application. And sometimes the thesis proposals are very vague, like, I like Roman history, so I'd like to do a thesis on Rome. And that's not really helpful. The more specific your thesis proposal is, like, the better idea you have of what specifically you want to work on when you enter the graduate program, the better as far as a committee is concerned.
So the key here with finding a supervisor, and to be really honest, this can be tricky, because the key is about having a really good idea of what it is that you want to study. So I just want to emphasize again that most of the programs that we're talking about, if they require a supervisor, right? So we have some that don't, right? But most of our graduate programs do require a supervisor. And if they require a supervisor, it's because it's a very research-based, research-focused graduate program. So you're going to really delve into a particular topic. And so you need to have a good idea of what it is that you want to study. As Suzanne and Chris were just saying, in terms of your sort of proposal, your ideas, and that might shift once you take coursework. But at least at the beginning, you have to have a pretty solid idea of what you want to study, so that you can try to find a supervisor that studies that area or has expertise in that area or is interested in that area, because you're really going to work with them very, very closely. And so the first key is having a good, spending a good long time thinking about what you want to study, and then doing a lot of homework, reading our websites and our, reading about our faculty members, seeing if they take graduate students, and then seeing what their research is. So reading some of their papers, reading some of their work, so that you can then contact them with a really clear idea and say, you study this, and I'm really interested in this, and I think this would be a great opportunity would you be willing to consider working together? And so the key to finding a supervisor is to pitch a really specific, like pretty specific idea. So what doesn't really work very well is an email, because you have to remember faculty members get tons of these emails. And if, as Chris said, if they just say, I'm really interested in history, and I'd like to do an MA with you, that's probably not going to work very well. Right. So whereas if you say, I've actually read your paper on Roman battles in the Colosseum, and I'm very interested in this particular aspect of that and studying it, and here's the background I have that would help me study that, could we meet to discuss possible projects? That is the key way to find a supervisor.
And I think for a lot of faculty, they're very busy. They don't have a lot of time. And So when they're considering students, one of the things that is going to be really compelling, and you're going to be really interested in having a student work with you, is if they've taken the time to do their research. They've sent a personalized email saying, I am interested in doing this program and working with you because you're studying this. Taylor, when I study eyewitness memory, and when I get emails from people that say, oh, well, I'm interested in clinical psychology, I essentially write them a polite email that says, I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in that topic and I don't have the expertise to supervise you. So one of the things I think that makes that can be really helpful for your application, and which will help motivate your potential supervisor to help you get in a good application, is if you do some of that background where you look at and research the potential supervisor, find the places where your interests match, and you can read some of their published works, or even scan them, or just ask them questions about them. You can try to kind of build on what they seem to be researching, and by saying, like, this is what I'm interested in terms of a potential project that builds on what you're already doing, and stuff like that. I think it's just really, really important to tailor your emails and your conversations, not just to say, I'm interested in what you're doing, because of course, you can look on a supervisor's website and it'll say they're doing this, this, and this, and you could just, list those things. But to actually give some thought to what is it about their work that you're interested in? What would you like to do? What makes you curious about this? And I think that personal touch goes a really, really long way to making you memorable and motivating a supervisor to try and help you get in the door.
Certainly you can apply if you're finishing up your undergraduate degree. Like, that's quite common to have people with, you've found a supervisor, you found an area, sure, you're not quite done. And so if you're admitted, you'd be admitted with a conditional acceptance. And the condition would be on successfully completing your bachelor's degree.
Generally, again, that's something to discuss with a potential supervisor. First of all, do they think the discipline you're coming from is related to the one they teach in? Like, does your previous work and academic experience qualify you for a graduate degree in their department?
The other thing is the individualized interdisciplinary programs do, potentially offer opportunities for some sort of kind of multidisciplinary research projects, about thinking a bit specifically about what it is you want to study. Because so to answer the actual question, it's a bit of both. Mm-hmm. You need to find a supervisor based on your research interests, but it also has to be sort of within your area of studies. I would, if I were you, draft a bit of a very brief sort of proposal of what you're thinking and float it around to different supervisors.